1921, early summer, the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy at Etajima was not merely a school. It was a psychological forge. It was designed to strip away individual identity and hammer the surviving material into a perfect instrument of the state. The cadets breathed Spartan discipline. It was a grueling green nightmare where biting ants swarmed neglected foxholes and upperclassmen inflicted harsh physical punishments. The grim naval hierarchy was defined by an old saying: officers, NCOs, cattle meaning enlisted men, and lastly, the cadets themselves. Tamechi Hara, a plebe from a poor family, felt the constant distress and depression of this environment. Yet he clung fiercely to the Bushido principles instilled by his grandfather Moichiro. A samurai, he believed, must always be prepared to die. The brutality was briefly tempered when Admiral Suzuki arrived as commandant. He forbade physical discipline, declaring plainly, "This school is supposed to produce fine officers, not cattle." But the essential lesson remained. The path to becoming a qualified seaman required at least 10 years of arduous dedication. The rigid demands of Imperial service tested that dedication far more than the sea ever could. In 1926, the conflict between duty and desire reached a crisis point for Hara. His relationship with the geisha Utamaru threatened to derail his entire career. She had bought expensive kimonos and accrued debt during their time together. Hara knew the military tolerated no such entanglements, yet he had behaved according to my own desires. Utamaru declared the few months shared with him were the happiest of her life, but she chose to seek a new life in America, leaving Hara exposed and vulnerable. The confrontation arrived in the form of Captain Mitsumasa Yonai. Yonai was a taciturn, dignified leader who sat straight as a stoic samurai. Hara stood before him, the air thick with unspoken accusation.
Yonai looked at the young officer with cold disappointment.
"You stupid idiot." Yonai's voice was low, yet it struck Hara like a physical blow. "I had never figured you for such a moron. The Imperial Navy cannot tolerate an officer's living with a geisha. Are you mad? Are you out of your mind?" Hara was filled with shame as the disgrace of his private life was laid bare, that stood before a man he deeply respected, a man known to grapple with junior officers in off-duty judo sessions, standing like a rock. Hara knew the Navy demanded absolute purity of purpose. The choice was stark and absolute, the geisha or the uniform. They chose the uniform, the path of duty sealing the catastrophic end of his romance and forcing him back into the military's unforgiving embrace. The Navy, meanwhile, was grappling with a disgrace of its own. The Washington Naval Conference of 1922 had restricted Japan's battleship tonnage. They were limited to 60% of the tonnage permitted the United States and Britain. This decision fostered deep, burning resentment throughout the officer corps. The mandated destruction or conversion of powerful warships like the Kaga and Tosa brought tears to the eyes of many officers. From that moment onward, the United States was no longer merely a potential enemy, it was a probable one. All subsequent maneuvers were carried out on the theory that the hypothetical enemy was the Americans. This strategic resentment fueled fierce innovation. Hara threw himself into his work, meticulously revising the accepted torpedo doctrine. He calculated the flaws of the standard 20-degree spread, where a direct hit was little more than pure chance. By mid-1932, he completed a new manual that revolutionized the doctrine. His personal accomplishment was complemented by the secret development of the oxygen-fueled torpedo. This technological marvel was capable of running 40,000 meters at 36 knots without leaving a visible track. This dazzling tactical superiority, however, masked a fatal strategic flaw. It relied on an underestimation of American industrial power and an over-reliance on surface dominance. Even then, the dominance of air power was beginning to assert itself. As the decade progressed, internal political extremism further destabilized the nation. Prime Minister Tsuyoshi Inukai was assassinated in 1932. An attempted coup followed in 1936. This political chaos culminated in the army hotheads scuttling Admiral Yonai's cabinet in July 1940 because he resisted the tripartite pact. The last major voice of caution was gone. By the autumn of 1941, the Allied blockade had Japan gasping for life. The nation was strangled of petroleum, iron ore, and rubber. The High Command, seeing no alternative, began the final mobilization for war. October 9th, 1941, was an unforgettable day. 200 warships of the combined fleet assembled in Hiroshima Bay. The mirror-like water reflected the blue mountains, and countless seagulls skimmed between the ships. The atmosphere was one of stillness and false peace. On the destroyer Amatsukaze, Commander Tamechi Hara felt the somber mood descend. The unusual WYZ code signal had summoned all commanding officers to the flagship. Hundreds of officers filled the spacious stern deck, grave and serious. The crisp autumn weather could not dissipate the oppressive atmosphere. Admiral Yamamoto began his address. His voice was low, but his words struck the assembled men like a thunderbolt. Our combined fleet has completed preparations for war. We will continue our training on that basis. He stated plainly that Japan might be forced to take up arms against America, Britain, Australia, and the Netherlands rather than succumb to strangulation. Vice Admiral Ugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff, followed. His broad shoulders drooped forward, and his wry smile looked more like a frown. He detailed the horrific results of the Allied embargo. "This may be the last meeting of its kind," Ugaki said, his words faltering. "We may not be able to see each other again in this fashion." He cautioned them to ensure their men had proper rest and sleep, even during the most rigid training. Fitness was essential, he stressed, even if we are preparing for certain death. The officers departed, stunned by the finality of the decision. The preparations were complete, and the political calculus had failed. Now, only the final command remained. On December 2nd, after the Amatsukaze and the fleet had entered Palau Harbour, the coded message was received. It was short, irrevocable, and final. Nitakayama Nobore 1208.
Climb Mount Nitakaha.
December 8th, Japanese date. The nation was launched into war. The war began not with a bang, but with a flop. Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka's attack on Davao was a complete flop, hitting an empty bag. This jarring reality refused to match the seamless narrative of victory expected by the High Command. About Commander Tamechi Hara, aboard the destroyer Amatsukaze, the initial days were a complex mix of anticipation, dread, and profound ethical struggle. On December 6, before the official declaration, Hara's small squadron of 6 destroyers and a cruiser steamed out of Palau. At 1600 hours, sonar detected a submarine. Standing orders implied hostile action was permissible only out of absolute necessity. Yet the opportunity for a tactical kill was immediate. Hara stood on the bridge, the tension mounting in the cramped confines of the Amatsukaze. The fate of the distant vessel, and perhaps the slim chance for peace, hung in his wavering decision-making process. He called off the depth charge attack, a moment of high tension and ethical struggle. He was driven by a desperate hope that the conflict might still be avoided. Just 3 days later, on December 9th, he monitored a message from submarine I-65. The message confirmed the enemy was operating without aerial escorts, a dangerous and tempting vulnerability. But the world was already changing around them. On December 10th, 1941, radio reports detailed an event that fundamentally altered the understanding of modern naval power. The British battleship Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser Repulse had been sunk by Japanese airplanes alone. Hara listened, bewildered, as a wave of awe gripped the bridge crew. Unbelievable things were happening, he thought. The realization struck him like a physical blow. Traditional surface naval warfare, the very domain of the destroyer man, was suddenly obsolete. Air power dominated the seas. The expertise they had honed over decades was suddenly diminished. The wave of initial Japanese successes continued, yet they were built on a foundation of critical flaws. Hara felt a deep frustration, lamenting that while war is a series of mistakes, Japan could not afford mistakes. Overconfidence and the systematic underestimation of the enemy led directly to hasty operations. The culture of conserving ammunition severely hampered effective naval gunnery, a grim reality that contrasted sharply with the Allies' seemingly endless supply of bombs. Early losses quickly underscored these tactical weaknesses. The destroyers Kisaragi and Hayate were sunk at Wake Island on December 11th. Then Sagiri was torpedoed by a Dutch submarine off Borneo. The air raid on Malalag Harbour on January 4, 1942, demonstrated a critical lack of defensive preparedness when 14 major Japanese warships were trapped and vulnerable. Hara watched the cruiser Myoko limp away for repairs, feeling utterly miserable. This frustration boiled over during the Ambon Island invasion on February 1st. Commander Konosuke Aeki, leading the landing troops, was pinned down and signaled, "We are pinned down and the landing is thwarted." His commander, Admiral Tanaka, would not ask for support bombardment due to strict orders to conserve ammunition as much as practicable. Hara, squirming with vexation on the Amatsukaze's bridge, called the situation disgusting in every respect. Why did he have to die like that? Hara muttered to his officers. A preliminary bombardment and continued shipboard fire support would have spared his life and many others. Stupid, stupid, yet the Japanese surge continued southward, culminating in the decisive Battle of the Java Sea. The tropical heat was a physical weight, pressing down on the sailors and making patience thin. It was February 27, 1942. The Japanese task force, led by Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, was hunting the Allied fleet. On the bridge of the Amatsukaze, Hara felt the cold sweat run down his back. This was his first major battle, a confrontation that would secure Japanese control of the Dutch East Indies. Admiral Takagi, the overall commander, was initially overconfident, believing the enemy ships were merely evading air raids and were in no shape to fight us. But the Allied fleet, though desperately lacking coordination, was not broken. At 17:30 hours on February 27th, the Dutch cruiser De Ruyter was sighted, closing rapidly at 28,000 meters. Battle orders were issued at 17:46. The sea quickly began churning with smoke and spray. Hara watched as the Naka opened fire at 17:47. Rear Admiral Nishimura's squadron released 43 torpedoes at 18:05. The Allied ships responded with surprising evasive maneuvers, their unconventional 90-degree turns frustrating the Japanese gunners. The air was thick with the smell of burnt powder and the acrid tang of tropical humidity. The sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the engagement into a desperate night action. The Japanese heavy cruisers, Nachi and Haguro, ships that packed the punch of 10 destroyers combined, were the decisive factor. At 00:53 on February 28, the Nachi released 8 torpedoes. The Haguro followed quickly with 4. The results were immediate and devastating. At 01:06, the Dutch cruiser Java was struck and began to sink rapidly. 4 minutes later, the De Ruyter burst into flames, becoming a massive scarlet pyre on the dark water. The cries of Banzai and the sound of dancing on the decks of Nachi and Haguro echoed across the water. It was a stark contrast to the grim tension on the Amatsukaze. The battle continued into the next night. On March 1st, the remaining Allied cruisers Houston and Perth made a desperate attack on a 56-ship Japanese convoy in Banton Bay. Japanese destroyers swarmed them, sinking both vessels. General Hitoshi Imamura, the top army commander, was even thrown into the sea during the landing chaos. The Java Sea was now a Japanese lake. Hara found little cause for elation in the victory. Amidst the mop-up operations, the Amatsukaze pursued a damaged submarine. The speed increased to 26 knots, the ship vibrating violently. A lookout shouted, spotting a black object. Searchlights illuminated the target. It was a submarine, disabled and offering no resistance. Hara ordered fire at 2,500 meters. The shells tore into the hull. As the submarine began to sink, the sight of the miserable, defeated men floating in the water was too much like cold-blooded murder. Hara closed his eyes, the elation of the kill diminished by the pitiable scene. The aftermath was grim. Heavy oil stretched out for miles on the surface of the sea, marking the graves of the sunk vessels. Over 100 Caucasian survivors were found adrift, their desperate cries of "water, water" ringing out. A lieutenant could only reply, hang on, a rescue ship will come soon." The victory had secured the resource-rich Dutch East Indies, but it had come at a cost to the men fighting it. Hara, who had been an irresolute, wavering skipper before the war, was now a fierce and determined officer. He was disgusted by the repeated blunders of the High Command, yet driven by a newfound resolve to survive. The war machine rolled on, powered by these initial tactical successes. Hara returned to the peaceful, island-dotted inland sea, where seagulls cried and fishing boats tooted greetings. The crew was jubilant, the Amatsukaze almost rocking with their joy, singing and dancing. Hara's reunion with his family in Kamakura was a deeply emotional moment, his young son shouting, "Daddy, Daddy." The brutal reality of the front line faded briefly against the backdrop of domestic peace, but the elation was short-lived. The strategic blunder that would ultimately turn the tide occurred far to the north, at the Battle of Midway Island in June 1942. The mighty Nagumo task force was being cut to ribbons. The carriers Kaga, Soryu, and Akagi were set afire. The last operational carrier, Hiryu, was also lost. The High Command, in a catastrophic attempt to preserve morale and conceal weakness, declared victory in official communiques. They ordered all personnel not to talk about the battle. The real details were labeled top secret, even from commanding officers. The defeat was compounded by Admiral Yamamoto's next error. Rather than maintaining a forward presence at bases like Truk, Yamamoto returned the combined fleet, including the massive 72,800-ton Yamato, to the safety of Japan after Midway. The combined fleet was fast asleep 2,700 miles away in Japan's inland sea. This vacuum of power was precisely what the Americans exploited. On August 7, 1942, the Allies landed at Guadalcanal. Yamamoto's decision to conserve his battleships and carriers left the forward bases vulnerable and allowed the Americans to establish a critical foothold. The piecemeal commitment of destroyers in the Solomons, without adequate air or larger warship support, began in earnest. The workhorses of the fleet were being sent to be slaughtered. 12 destroyers were sunk between August 1942 and February 1943 alone. The tide of the Pacific War had turned, not solely at Midway, but in the subsequent fatal decision to retreat and conserve power while the enemy dug in. The American landing at Guadalcanal in August 1942 delivered a strategic shockwave. It jolted the High Command out of its post-Midway stupor. But their reaction was confused, piecemeal aggression. The entire operation was immediately crippled by fatally flawed intelligence. Japanese military attachés in Moscow had claimed only 2,000 enemy troops were present. They predicted a rapid, immediate withdrawal. Tokyo tragically heeded this erroneous report. The result was the annihilation of the first wave of lightly equipped Japanese ground troops. On the night of August 18th, 800 soldiers landed. They were met by approximately 20,000 well-equipped United States Marines. Fewer than 200 Japanese survived the initial brutal contact. Admiral Yamamoto's strategic misjudgments only compounded the disaster. His preoccupation with hoarding the remaining carriers and battleships was a conservation strategy born purely of fear. This left the frontline destroyers starved of support. The massive 69,100-ton Yamato sat safely in Truk Harbor. It was a potent symbol of power, rendered completely inert. Yamamoto's Lion had closed its eyes. It was only shaken awake on August 20th by the sighting of an enemy task force. The immediate response was frantic and ill-conceived. Yamamoto cancelled a fuel stopover. He ordered the smallest of the combined fleet carriers, the 10,150-ton Ryojo, to act as a decoy. The Ryojo, commanded by Captain Tadao Kato, was assigned pilots. Tamechi Hara, watching from the bridge of the Amatsukaze, knew those pilots were sadly inexperienced. Hara watched with growing irritation as the carrier began turning clumsily into the wind to launch its few aircraft. It was approximately 1400 hours. The weather was suddenly favorable for an American attack. Scores of American SBD Dauntless dive bombers and Grumman fighters descended upon the carrier. The Ryujo's 12 anti-aircraft guns spat sporadically. But the carrier was sluggish, making her an easy target. 2 or 3 bombs pierced the flight deck near the stern, instantly igniting the fuel tanks. Scarlet flames shot violently skyward, followed by ominous internal explosions. The carrier was instantly engulfed in thick black smoke. Huge water pillars surrounded her as near misses erupted the sea. Hara, on the Amatsukaze, ordered a desperate, frantic zigzag maneuver. The destroyer surged forward at 33 knots. Her bow waves were tremendous, drenching the deck completely. The ship sustained no direct hits, but the near misses made the hull shudder violently. When the attack pulled away 30 minutes later, the black smoke began to dissipate. It revealed the Ryojo in her death throes, had stopped all forward motion and was sinking, listing heavily to starboard. Her red belly was exposed as waves washed over her flight deck. The carrier had become a huge stove, full of holes which belched eerie red flames. The Amatsukaze desperately moved in for rescue. Over 300 survivors boarded the destroyer, including Captain Kato, who looked haggard and pathetic. Hara felt pity for the defeated man. He also felt anger toward the high command that had assigned such a futile mission. As the evacuation finished, the Ryujo disappeared beneath the waves. The sinking created a tremendous whirlpool that made the Amatsukaze bob like a cork. The strategic situation immediately devolved into a logistical nightmare. The Japanese Navy could not seize air superiority. They were forced to use their high-speed destroyers for nightly resupply runs, ferrying troops and meager rations into the Guadalcanal meat grinder. These dangerous missions became known to the Americans as the Tokyo Express. The night of November 12th was a maelstrom of confusion and violence. It would become one of the most savage sea battles of modern history. Admiral Abe's squadron was tasked with bombarding Henderson Field. They approached Guadalcanal under a blessed squall, a tremendous, driving tropical rainstorm that brought darkness and concealment. Ensign Shoji, drenched and weary, voiced the crew's ennui. "Phew," he complained. "This rain is killing me. I am fed up," he added. "Let us fight the Americans, not this rain." Abe, however, proved overly cautious. He ordered a 180-degree turn as they neared Guadalcanal around 2200 hours. Hara, on the Amatsukaze, watched in utter disbelief. "Oh no," he thought. "Has Heie lost its mind?" The rain squall ended precisely at 2240. It left the Japanese formation scattered and dangerously vulnerable. At 2342, the destroyer Udachi reported, "Enemy sighted." Minutes later, at 2350, the battleship Heie shone its massive searchlight. It illuminated the American light cruiser Atlanta and unleashed a devastatingly accurate opening salvo. The battlefield instantly devolved into a close-quarters free-for-all. It was a mammoth matchbox where ships were identified and destroyed at point-blank range. Lieutenant Miyoshi screamed, "Commander, let's fire the fish." Hara, gripping the rail, responded instantly. "Ready torpedoes," he shouted. "Fire!" 8 oxygen-fueled torpedoes hissed into the water at 2354. One of those fish instantly sank the destroyer USS Barton, but the chaos was absolute and overwhelming. The Amatsukaze found herself in the thick of the melee, maneuvering violently. Hara ordered 4 more torpedoes fired at 2359 toward a distant cruiser. Moments later, a phantom ship crossed the Amatsukaze's bow. It was the heavily damaged USS San Francisco, spewing fire and smoke. Hara realized he had fired too soon. He cursed his own stupidity. Through haste, he had lost the chance to make a certain sinking. Then, the Amatsukaze was caught in the crossfire. Shells from the American light cruiser USS Helena ripped into the destroyer. The impact was deafening. The air filled with the shriek of tearing metal and the sickening smell of ozone and burning oil. The ship shuddered violently, and then everything went dark. The Amatsukaze was struck by 32 holes larger than 1 meter, plus countless smaller ones. 43 crewmen were lost, including Lieutenant Shimizu, the tyrannical gunnery officer. He was blasted from the ship, leaving behind only one of his legs. Warrant Officer Shigeru Iwata's frantic warning saved them from immediate destruction. "Commander," he yelled, "another cruiser is sniping at us from 70 degrees to port." The rudder mechanism was crippled, and the gun turret's hydraulic systems had failed completely. The Amatsukaze was dead in the water, listing heavily, a floating wreck. Hara took the helm himself. It was a back-breaking task. For the next 15 hours, he directed 10 husky men, his voice croaking with exhaustion, sweat streaming down his face. They manually steered the crippled vessel. The Amatsukaze skidded across the dark ocean like a drunken man, mistaken for a useless wreck by the enemy. The immense psychological strain was palpable. The subsequent sea burial for the lost crew was performed under a big, fiery sun. It was a somber, silent ritual. The strategic shift was now complete. The Amatsukaze was no longer an offensive warship. She was a workhorse, desperately clinging to life, her mission now reduced entirely to mere survival. The Japanese could not match the American capacity for industrial replacement. The Amatsukaze, now a floating wreck, required massive repairs and was out of action for months. The strategic result of the November battles was disastrous. Despite tactical successes, such as the sinking of the USS Juno, the Japanese failed to deliver critical supplies. This failure ultimately crippled the ground forces on Guadalcanal and sealed the island's fate. The Tokyo Express had failed to outrun the American industrial capacity and their emerging radar technology. Hara's personal resilience, steering his crippled ship manually, stood in stark contrast to the increasing strategic futility surrounding him. He later confided to a neighbor back home that they had won a series of battles simply because the enemy outblundered them. He saw the truth clearly. There was no room for optimism for Japan in this war. The Japanese were being bled white, their best officers and men sacrificed in a war of attrition they could never win. The early months of 1943 were defined by grim strategic necessity. The Japanese Navy had failed at Guadalcanal, forcing them to execute Operation K. It was the meticulous secret evacuation of the island. Across 3 harrowing nights in February, they successfully extracted 12,198 Army men and 8,132 Navy men, but the success of the withdrawal only masked the massive overall defeat. They left behind 16,800 Japanese bodies. The evacuees who survived were living skeletons, unable even to express joy. It was a testament to the extreme conditions and the scarcity of basic commodities endured on that island. Commander Tamechi Hara, now a seasoned veteran of the Solomon's meat grinder, faced a new frustrating task. He was ordered to train a fresh, ill-disciplined bunch of landlubbers for Destroyer Division 27. His new command, the destroyer Shigure, was a decrepit hulk, a far cry from the sleek performance of the Amatsukaze. The Shigure needed an overhaul so badly that Hara doubted she could even make 30 knots. He confided his weariness and the desperate situation to Admiral Kondo. Kondo, visibly exhausted himself, offered a stark warning. "Hara, you have all my sympathy in your new assignment. It is a tough one. I can only say, take care of yourself. Use every possible caution." The war had accelerated into a merciless battle of attrition, driven by new Allied tactics. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea, on March 2nd and 3rd, 1943, proved catastrophic. It exposed the utter vulnerability of Japanese convoys, 8 transports and 4 destroyers, carrying more than 3,500 soldiers, were annihilated. They were destroyed by unhindered enemy air attacks. The Americans had introduced a devastating new technique called skip bombing. Aircraft would skim the waves to deliver bombs, a method the Japanese surface fleet had no effective counter for whatsoever. The disconnect between the front lines and Tokyo was becoming palpable. Commander Enpei Kanuka, a naval liaison assistant to Premier General Tojo, revealed a shocking truth. For 5 months, Tojo had asked for no advice, no briefing, no business, nothing at all. Kanuka's only duty was attending nightly cocktail parties for VIPs. This was a bizarre indulgence while the fleet was being bled white at the front. Hara's own frustration boiled over during a meeting. "I don't know how you who are stationed here view things from the homeland," he stated, "but it is hell at the front. We have had some tactical victories, but we are suffering a strategic defeat." The relentless attrition continued unabated. In Vella Gulf, the destroyers Minaguma and Murasame were sunk before they could even fire a shot. They were victims of radar-controlled gunfire. The Japanese had no reliable answer for this technology. Yet the Japanese Navy stubbornly adhered to repeating operational formulas that had once been successful. This rigidity would prove absolutely fatal. The High Command ignored the clear threat of Allied radar and torpedo ambushes. They ordered Destroyer Division 4 to repeat the exact same troop transport run through Vella Gulf. Captain Hara, commander of Destroyer Division 27 and captain of the Shigure, was summoned to a conference on August 4th. He voiced his dissent vehemently against repeating this operational formula. He quoted the legendary swordsman Musashi Miyamoto. "It is bad to repeat a formula," Hara warned, "and to repeat it a 3rd time is worse." Captain Sugiura, chairman of Destroyer Division 4, chaired the meeting, his face strained by the weight of command. "Hara, I see your point," Sugiura replied, "but I already have my orders." The orders were followed. At 22:40 on the night of August 6th, the 4 destroyers of Division 4 Arashi, Hajikaze, Kawakaze, and Shigure steamed through Blackett Strait. They carried 820 troops destined for column Bangara. Hara's Shigure was the last ship in the column. The night was thick and dark. The sea was oily black. The American destroyers, equipped with superior radar, were waiting. They were a perfect ambush, invisible ghosts on the water, tracking the Japanese column with cold precision. At 23:41, Lookout Yamashita on the Shigure's bridge screamed, his voice cut through the humid night air. "White waves, black objects," he yelled. "Several ships heading toward us," Hara reacted with a strangled cry of frustration. "Damn, damn." The leading destroyers, Arashi and Hagikaze, remained tragically oblivious. They were steaming straight into the trap. The ambush was instantaneous and devastating. Without firing a single warning shot, the American destroyers launched their torpedoes. Long, dark wakes streaked across the water, converging rapidly on the Japanese column. A tremendous, violent explosion erupted at the head of the line. The Arashi was hit first, followed immediately by the Kawakaze. The shockwave slammed into the Shigure. The radio room confirmed the horror. Arashi and Kawakaze sent brief messages saying they were hit by torpedoes, the report stated. "We have heard nothing from Hagikaze. The Shigure was at a distinct disadvantage. The remaining Japanese ships were scattered, and the enemy was still unseen." Hara felt the crushing weight of responsibility.
I could not leave my friends in the lurch, he thought.
And yet, there was little I could do against an opposition greatly outnumbering us. He made the agonizing decision to withdraw. It was a hard decision, he later recounted, that there was no alternative. He ordered the Shigure to turn, leaving the burning wrecks of his comrades behind. The battle was over in minutes. A perfect American victory. A perfect trap. 3 Japanese destroyers, Arashi, Hagikaze, and Kawakaze, were sunk. 700 crewmen and 820 troops were lost. The Shigure miraculously survived, untouched. It earned the first whispers of the nickname, the Indestructible Destroyer. The defeat fundamentally altered Japanese strategy and closed the vital supply route through Vella Gulf. The swift tempo of attrition continued, consuming destroyers and their experienced crews. The Shigure's survival was attributed to sheer luck and Captain Hara's rapid, unconventional seamanship. He quickly became known as the Miracle Captain. His crew, transformed into a proud, tightly woven team, developed fierce loyalty. This loyalty was tested when Lookout Yamashita, the man who first spotted the enemy in Vella Gulf, got into a fight ashore. He had heard insults about his ship and division. Yamashita's face was swollen, his eye blackened. Hara, though initially furious, recognized the fierce pride behind the transgression. They gifted Yamashita his old watch. "You did a great job," Hara said. "I want you to have this. It is not much. I bought it 20 years ago at Wanamaker's department store in New York City." The Shigure was immediately pressed into continuous service, often escorting desperate troop reinforcement missions. The Allied technological advantage grew daily. During the Rakata evacuation, 8 bombers assailed the destroyers, employing the devastating skip bombing tactics. The Shigure's hull quivered like a leaf under the onslaught of near misses. Water erupted in huge pillars around them. In November 1943, the High Command's complacency was about to be shattered. A massive American counteroffensive was coming. Admiral Koga, the commander-in-chief, had been lulled by deceptively positive reports following the Battle of Empress Augusta Bay. He completely underestimated the scale and reach of American air power. He was not alone in this fatal optimism. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, 2nd Fleet Commander, was also complacent due to a lack of recent combat. They'd been enjoying the country club atmosphere of Truk. The High Command's strategy of conservation had spectacularly backfired. They had carefully preserved their capital ships, the heavy cruisers Atago, Maya, Takao, Mogami, and Chikuma, along with the light cruisers Agano and Noshiro, but they had only succeeded in exposing them. These massive vessels were now sitting ducks in the narrow confines of Rabaul Harbor. On November 5th, the sky turned black. American aircraft arrived in a torrential rain of bombs. Captain Hara, aboard the Shigure, which was temporarily docked, witnessed the terrifying inferno firsthand. All guns pointed skyward, the air thick with the smell of cordite and the deafening roar of engines. The Japanese ships were caught trying to get underway, and were battered mercilessly. The scale of the disaster was immense. Bombs slammed into the heavy cruisers, the Otago was heavily damaged, the Maya suffered serious hits, and the Mogami was crippled completely. Hara watched as the capital ships, symbols of the Imperial Navy's surface strength, were eviscerated before his eyes. Later that evening, a celebratory dinner was held in Rabaul. It was intended to honor the Shigure's remarkable survival of nearly 3 months without a scratch. The atmosphere of forced celebration was suddenly shattered by a drunken, bitter outburst from a staff officer. He shouted that the life expectancy of Rabaul-based destroyers had averaged something under 2 months. "Must we put up with such a situation?" the officer roared, his face flushed with alcohol and despair. "Why do all our big ships just sit at truck? In this critical theater, why do destroyers have to shoulder the entire burden without the support of our carriers, battleships, and cruisers?" He pounded the table, sending the glasses jumping. "It is we who are being bled white, not the enemy." The officer's lament was the undeniable truth of the war. The High Command's conservation had merely preserved their assets long enough to be destroyed in a single catastrophic air raid. The holiday cruise for the capital ships was definitively over. Rabaul was no longer a safe place. The destruction of those capital ships, coupled with the annihilation of 5 Japanese destroyers by Captain Arleigh A. Burke's radar-equipped forces off Rabaul on November 24th, brutally exposed the technical superiority of the United States Navy.
One of the destroyed destroyers, the Mikinami, broke clean in two.
Hara, the miracle captain, sailed the Shigure back to Sasebo for repairs. His ship was a testament to his seamanship, yet it was also a grim reminder of the war's trajectory. The destroyer returned, with a gaping 2-foot hole in its rudder. It was a silent wound from an enemy torpedo that had miraculously failed to explode. The war was no longer being fought by individual bravery or tactical skill. It was being decided by radar, by overwhelming air power, and by the industrial output of the United States. Night supremacy, the traditional pride of the Imperial Navy, was dead. The Imperial Japanese Navy was staggering toward its end. Its final maneuvers were less strategic planning than a series of desperate convulsions. The crushing defeats at the Marianas in June of 1944, known forever as the Marianas Turkey Shoot, had effectively wiped out the remaining core of Japan's naval aviation. 4 months later, the Battle of Leyte Gulf delivered the coup de grace to the surface fleet. Admiral Kurita, commanding the center force, famously retired during the battle, out of sheer physical exhaustion. This was a devastating admission of the physical and mental strain on the aged, tired admirals who still clung to high command. Admiral Ozawa, commanding the sacrificial Northern Force, declared himself ashamed to have survived the battle. The leadership's adherence to the conservation strategy had not produced the decisive battle they craved. It had only ensured the piecemeal, unavoidable destruction of their assets. In the aftermath, the combined fleet was unbelievably shrunk, reduced to a collection of scattered, damaged vessels. The strategic and material inferiority was now so profound that the High Command turned to the unthinkable. Mass suicide tactics. The formation of the Kamikaze Corps was the most visible manifestation of this fatal ideology. It was a grim symbol of a nation prioritizing suicidal sacrifice over rational strategy. Other measures were equally desperate. They deployed frogmen equipped with lightweight diving gear. They created explosive torpedo boats, plywood motorboats, with explosive warhead bows, aptly dubbed surface kamikaze craft. Captain Tamaichi Hara, now assigned to the Naval Torpedo School, watched this descent into madness with profound bitterness. His students, reservists and former aviation personnel, were clumsy, ill-equipped, and clearly destined for annihilation. He saw the new torpedo boats, barely making 18 knots, as nothing but a barge, useless in a real fight. The horrifying announcement of the Kamikaze Corps drove Hara to an emotional breakdown. He wept aloud, calling the tactics inhuman and intolerable. He was infuriated that the nation that produced the world's greatest battleships could not produce a satisfactory, functional torpedo boat. His old flagship, the Shigure, the miracle destroyer, had barely survived Leyte Gulf, the sole operational destroyer of the Nishimura force. But even its luck was finite. Hara felt a bitter pessimism shrivel his heart, knowing the end was near. In December 1944, Hara was relieved of his training duties and assigned to the light cruiser Yahagi as her new captain. The Yahagi joined the remnants of the Second Fleet at Hashirajima. This pitiful collection included the massive 72,000-ton battleship Yamato, 1 cruiser, and 10 destroyers. By March 1945, the war had closed in completely. American task forces struck at Kure and Kobe daily. The High Command, still clinging to the fantasy of a decisive, glorious end, finally made its decision. On April 5th, Admiral Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, decided to launch Operation Tengo. This was the special attack sortie toward Okinawa. The objective was simple: suicide. The fleet was allotted fuel for only a one-way trip. Admiral Keizo Komura, commander of Destroyer Squadron 2 aboard the Yahagi, was blunt with his chief of staff.
I told Kusaka that our little fleet has no chance against the might of the enemy forces, Komura stated.
Such an operation would be a genuine suicide sortie. Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito, who had replaced Kurita as commander of the Second Fleet, had no recent sea or combat experience, yet he embraced the fatalism of the mission.
I think we are being given an appropriate chance to die, Ito stated.
A samurai lives so that he is always prepared to die. Captain Hara utterly rejected the High Command's suicidal rhetoric. On the eve of the sortie, he gathered the crew of the Yahagi in the cramped, narrow spaces of the cruiser. He stood before them, his uniform crisp, his eyes intense, and delivered his own radical interpretation of Bushido. "You are not sheep-whipped to a sacrificial altar," Hara told them, his voice cutting through the tense atmosphere. "We are lions released in the arena to devour the enemy gladiators. You are not to be slain merely as sacrifices for the nation." Then came the order that defied every naval teaching: do not hesitate to come back alive. The crew, many of them youngsters fresh from the academy, were deeply confused by this directive. Lieutenant Kenji Hata, recalling the academy's rigid teachings, immediately asked for clarification. "Sir, we were taught that an officer lives and dies with his ship." Hara looked at the young officer patiently. "We are going to fight the enemy. If we succeed, we survive. If the ship sinks, you are to save yourselves and return to fight another day. The war is far from over in the homeland. If you die here, who will defend the empire?" The response was overwhelming. Chief Petty Officer Uchino declared that every man was eager to comply with the orders. Even a young lad pleaded, "Please allow me to stay, sir." He insisted he was not of much use, but would do any job if they let him stay. The crew, filling the hundreds of occupied hammocks, slept silently that night, their trust in their captain absolute. At 0400 on April 6th, the Second Fleet departed. The sky was leaden, promising a dismal day for the men about to sail towards certain death. A strange, terrible beauty clung to the shore. The distant mountains sparkled, and radiant cherry blossoms dotted the coastline. "This beautiful homeland is worthy of our sacrifices," Hara declared to Uchino. Uchino looked out at the tranquil, perfect scene, feeling a deep sense of unease. "A bit too beautiful, sir," he replied. The fleet, now 10 ships strong, steamed south. Their formation was a desperate, zigzagging ring against the aerial threat they knew was rapidly approaching. Only the Yamato and 2 destroyers possessed rudimentary anti-aircraft radar. The Yahagi's sets were only useful against surface targets, leaving them essentially blind to the skies. By 0900, the vulnerability was already showing. The destroyer Ashashimo reported engine trouble, a fatal flaw that would soon condemn her. At 11:30, the inevitable happened. A lone American seaplane was detected, circling the formation like a gnat sizing up its victims. The sacrifice was about to begin. The American air assault began at 12:30, 2 hours. Hundreds of planes, 386 carrier-based aircraft in total, swarmed the tiny Japanese fleet. "Open fire!" Hara roared. The air instantly filled with the whine and thud of machine gun bullets, beating like hail against the Yahagi's superstructure. Black bombs sent white spray towering 100 meters into the air. The first wave, which the sailors later called a merry-go-round of planes, methodically sized up their targets. The Yahagi's decks shuddered under the deafening drum of continuous machine gun fire. At 12:14, 6 hours, the first torpedo struck the cruiser. The impact was sickening, a dull, crushing blow that instantly brought the proud ship dead in the water. The vessel listed noticeably to starboard. Hara stood on the bridge, his mind reeling from the shock. He thought his proud cruiser was now nothing more than a mass of junk, barely afloat.
Admiral Komura, standing near Hara, remained unnervingly calm amid the chaos.
"Here they come," he simply said, as the second wave descended upon them. The air attacks were relentless, a continuous storm of metal. Torpedoes slammed into the hull, bombs exploded, ripping through the decks. Waves washed pools of blood from the deck, and dismembered bodies rolled into the sea. The Yahagi absorbed 6 torpedo and 12 direct bomb hits. Komura, seeing the ship tremble in its final throes, turned to Hara. "Hara, I guess we better get out of here," he stated. "It looks like now or never." "Let's go," Hara replied. Clinging to debris in the churning water, struggling against the spreading oil slick and the cries of the wounded, Hara watched the spectacular, horrifying death of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The Yamato, the mighty 72,000-ton battleship, was under simultaneous assault. Scores of American planes swarmed her like gnats intent on destruction. The battleship, already listing from earlier damage, took its first direct bomb hit at 12:40. The air was a deafening cacophony of explosions, the constant scream of diving planes, and the frantic barking of anti-aircraft guns. The Yamato endured, absorbing 11 torpedo and 6 bomb hits, but the end was certain. By 14:05, her trim was utterly irrecoverable. At 14:17, the last fatal torpedo found its mark. The colossal battleship rolled over, exposing her massive hull to the sky. Then, at 14:23, the world erupted. A tremendous detonation signaled the Yamato's final violent end. A frightening pillar of fire and white smoke came belching from the battleship, reaching 20,000 feet into the sky. It was a symbolic, terrifying end to the entire surface fleet. The sound was a low, rolling thunder that seemed to shake the very ocean beneath them. Hara, floating in the oil-soaked water, was dragged under by the gigantic invisible force of the sinking Yahagi. He was caught in the ship's powerful, sucking whirlpool. He emerged into the light, choking on seawater, the sharp pain of suffocation searing his lungs. Around him, oil-soaked survivors bobbed, initially mistaken by Hara for a Negro bathing beach due to the thick black crude coating their skin. Clinging to a log with Admiral Komura, Hara heard a distant, wavering melody. It was the song of the warrior, sung by the other survivors, a desperate attempt to bolster failing spirits. Hara, the miracle captain, had survived his final futile sortie. The cost of Operation Tengo was immense. Nearly 4,000 Japanese lives were lost from the 10 ships that sailed that day. This included 2,498 men from the Yamato and 446 from the Yahagi. Only 12 American lives were claimed in return. The Yahagi was gone. The Yamato was gone. The destroyers Ashashimo, Hamakaze, Isakaze, and Kasumi were gone. In a final, profound irony, underscoring the enemy's technological reach, Hara was eventually rescued by an American flying boat. His unique perspective, grounded in 100 combat sorties and the command of the fleet's workhorses, was thus preserved. That witnessed the death of the Imperial Japanese Navy firsthand, a tragedy born of flawed strategy and the fatal sacrifice of brave men. His survival, which he attributed entirely a matter of luck, ensured that the full, unvarnished story of the destroyers, the true workhorses who shouldered the heaviest burden of the war, would finally be told. Hara's account corrected the historical inaccuracies born of early, context-lacking Allied reports. If you value these historical accounts, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. It helps us preserve these stories. And please, share your own memories or thoughts in the comments below.